I still remember the day everyone at school pretended I didn't exist. It was my first day at Maplewood High, and I walked through those massive glass doors carrying a backpack that had seen better days. My heart hammering so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. The hallways were crowded with students laughing, talking, and showing off their designer clothes and shiny shoes, while I felt like a ghost drifting between them. "Hey, new girl." Someone called from a distance, and I turned, hoping it was an invitation, a chance to belong. But it wasn't. It was a cruel joke. Laughter erupted from a group of girls who looked at me like I was invisible, like I didn't even have a right to breathe in their world. My cheeks burned, and I wanted to disappear, to crawl into a corner and never come out. That day, I learned what it felt like to be ignored, to be invisible, to be treated like I didn't matter. At lunch, I sat alone on the edge of the cafeteria, poking at my sandwich while I watched groups of students whisper and giggle, their eyes flicking to me with quiet judgment. I could hear their whispers. Who even invited her here? Look at her shoes. She doesn't even belong. I wanted to run, to escape the stares, but something inside me whispered, "You will show them." I didn't know how, but I knew I wouldn't let them define me. Every day after that felt like a battle. I started carrying my books closer, walking faster to avoid the sneers, but deep down, I was learning to hide a fire that was slowly building inside me. That fire was my only friend, my only source of hope. I would go home at night and dream of a different life. A life where I could walk into a room and have people see me, respect me, maybe even envy me. I remember one day, the class bully, Jenna, tossed my notebook across the room, and I felt a surge of fear, embarrassment, and anger all at once. I picked it up quietly, my hands shaking, and whispered under my breath, "One day, I won't be the one on the floor." At that moment, the idea of revenge wasn't about hurting anyone else. It was about proving to myself that I could rise above every snicker, every glare, every dismissal. That's where my story begins, then in laughter, not in friends, not in acceptance suit in silence, in being unseen and in discovering the first sparks of a determination that would one day change my life forever. High school felt like a battlefield where I had no armor. Every day, I walked past groups of girls whispering, their eyes following me like I was a bug crawling across the floor. Teachers barely noticed me, and my classmates treated me like a shadow, someone who existed only to be stepped over. I remember one rainy afternoon, sitting alone under the bleachers during gym, water dripping down my hair, my shoes soaked and my heart heavier than the clouds above. That's when I made a promise to myself. I will never feel this small again. I started spending my evenings in the library, hiding behind stacks of books, reading about people who had changed the world, entrepreneurs who had started with nothing. I would imagine myself in their shoes, feeling their courage seep into my bones. One day, I found a worn-out book about starting a business with almost no money. I took it home, my fingers trembling as I flipped through the pages. Each story lit a spark. Each lesson whispered, "You can do this." My parents didn't have much, and I knew I couldn't rely on anyone else to give me a head start. I started small selling handmade bracelets, doodles, anything that could make a few extra dollars. I remember the first time someone actually paid me for my work, a neighbor who smiled and said, "You're good at this." I felt something I had never felt before. Validation, not from my classmates, not from the popular girls, but from myself. Slowly, my world began to shift. While other kids wasted hours gossiping, I was sketching business plans, calculating profits, and dreaming bigger than the cafeteria walls could ever hold. I still felt the sting of being ignored, and sometimes at night I would replay every insult, every laugh, letting it fuel my determination. By the time graduation rolled around, I had saved enough money to start a tiny online store from my bedroom. My classmates, the same people who had laughed at my backpack, didn't notice. They were too busy celebrating their own little victories to see me building a life that mattered. I kept my promise to myself quietly, letting my success whisper instead of scream, but inside my heart was roaring. That fire that had been hiding under my ribs since the first day of high school had grown into a blaze, and I was ready to burn through every obstacle. Every no I had heard, every sneer I had endured was turning into fuel. I didn't just want to be seen, I wanted to be unstoppable. And the world was about to notice, whether anyone liked it or not. Starting my first business was harder than I ever imagined. I was sitting on my bedroom floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes, sticky notes, and late-night takeout containers, trying to figure out how to make my tiny online store actually work. Every message I sent to potential customers felt like shouting into a void, and every rejection email made my chest tighten with doubt. Maybe this was a mistake, I whispered to myself one night, the only light in the room coming from my laptop screen. But then I remembered every time I had been ignored at school, every time I had been laughed at for being too poor or too quiet. Those memories burned inside me, not as pain anymore, but as a weapon. I had to turn every insult into motivation, every sneer into strategy. Slowly, I learned the tricks of the trade of social media marketing, customer service, even basic accounting. I watched free tutorials, read blogs, and experimented constantly, my hands trembling as I made my first real sale. The rush was unbelievable, a tiny victory that made me feel alive, like I was finally in control of my story. But then came the hardest part: competition. I was up against people with fancy offices, big budgets, and teams of helpers, while I was still sitting on my bedroom floor with sticky notes as my only team. One night, exhausted and on the verge of tears, I heard a knock at my door. It was my younger brother, smirking. "Still playing shopkeeper?" He teased. "Why don't you just give up? Nobody's paying attention to you anyway." For a moment, I felt my confidence waver, the old familiar feeling of being invisible creeping back. But then I looked at him and whispered, "One day, you'll see who really matters." That night, I stayed up until sunrise, creating a new marketing campaign, sending emails, reaching out to influencers. It was a turning point. Slowly, my small orders turned into steady sales. Word spread. People started noticing my products, and soon I couldn't handle the orders alone. I hired my first assistant, a young woman who believed in my vision as much as I did. And with every new challenge, my fire grew hotter. Every setback became a lesson, every doubter a reason to push harder. I still remembered the cafeteria, the sneers, the laughter, but they no longer held power over me. I was building something real, something that could not be ignored. And deep down, I knew that one day, those same people who had mocked me would finally look at me and realize that I had risen higher than anyone had expected, and that my silence had been far more powerful than their laughter ever was. Asterisk. The first time I realized I was no longer invisible was the day a big investor called me out of the blue. I was sitting in my tiny apartment, surrounded by piles of inventory and half-empty coffee cups, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I answered, my voice shaking with a mix of excitement and fear. On the other end, a calm, confident voice said, "I've been following your store. I think you have potential. I want to discuss a partnership." I stared at the phone as if it were a dream, my heart hammering so fast I thought it might burst. Me, the girl who had been ignored, laughed at, shoved aside in the hallways of Maplewood High. Could this really be happening? Over the next few weeks, I poured every ounce of energy I had into preparing for that meeting. One researched, rehearsed, and planned until my fingers were raw from taking notes. I wanted to make sure that when I walked into that room, No one could doubt my worth. The day finally came. I wore the only suit I could afford, a little stiff and oversized, but I held my head high and walked into that sleek office with my portfolio clutched tightly in my hands. The investor glanced at me, barely hiding a flicker of surprise, and I felt a familiar echo of high school sneers, but this time it didn't hurt. I took a deep breath and launched into my presentation, my voice steady, my ideas sharp, my vision clear. Questions came fast, but I answered each one with confidence, showing that I knew my business, my customers, and my future. When the meeting ended, the investor leaned back and said, "You've got fire, and I like fire. Let's make this happen." I left the building feeling like I was walking on air, tears burning in my eyes, a mix of relief, pride, and disbelief washing over me. That night, I sat on my balcony, looking out at the city lights, remembering every single moment I had been ignored, every insult, every laugh, every time someone told me I wasn't enough. And I realized something important: those people didn't matter anymore. I didn't need their approval. Every hardship, every lonely lunch, every tear shed in silence had led me here. That fire that had been quietly burning since high school was now ablaze, unstoppable and undeniable. I knew my life was changing, and deep down, I also knew that one day, the very people who had laughed at me would hear my name and finally understand just how far I had come. And that thought, the idea of turning every ounce of rejection into fuel for success, made my heart swell with something I had never felt before: pure, uncheckable triumph. Asterisk success didn't come without its battles. Just when I thought I had finally broken through, I discovered that someone I trusted completely was working against me. My first hired assistant, the one I had believed in, started making decisions behind my back, signing deals I hadn't approved, and even sharing my business strategies with a rival company. I remember the night I found out I had stayed late in the office, staring at spreadsheets when I noticed discrepancies that didn't make sense. My stomach sank and a cold wave of betrayal washed over me. I confronted her, my hands trembling as I slammed the papers on the desk. "Why?" I asked, my voice cracking. "After everything we built together, why would you do this?" She looked at me with a mix of guilt and defiance, shrugging as if what she did was normal. "It's business," she said, and in that moment I realized that trust could be a dangerous thing. My heart ached, not just from the financial loss, but from the fact that someone I had let in, someone I had relied on, had turned against me. I spent that night pacing the office, feeling anger, disappointment, and fear collide inside me. But I also realized something powerful: I couldn't let this destroy me. I had faced being invisible, being mocked, being underestimated, and I had survived all of it. This betrayal was just another test, another obstacle to push me higher. The next morning, I made a decision. I terminated her employment immediately, but I didn't stop there. I dove deeper into my business, scrutinizing every contract, every partnership, making sure nothing like this could happen again. I worked harder than ever, sometimes sleeping only a few hours a night, fueled by the memory of every person who had laughed at me, dismissed me, or tried to hold me back. Slowly, the company began to recover and grow stronger than before. Sales doubled, my brand started gaining international attention, and people who had once ignored me began noticing my name, my face, my success. I remember seeing an article online about my company, and my hands shook as I read it, realizing that I had not only survived betrayal, but I had transformed it into fuel that propelled me forward. And deep inside, a quiet, satisfying thought lingered: those who had doubted me, who had laughed and ignored me, would eventually hear my story and understand that the quiet girl they overlooked had become someone unstoppable. That fire, the one that had started in a lonely cafeteria and burned through endless nights of work, was now an inferno, and nothing, not even betrayal, could put it out. Asterisk the day I truly felt the world noticed me was unforgettable. I was invited to speak at a business conference, a room filled with people I had once only dreamed of meeting, gamesters, entrepreneurs, and media personalities who dominated industries I had admired from afar. Walking into that grand hall, my heels clicking against the marble floor, I felt a familiar tug of nerves, the same one I had felt in high school hallways, standing alone while everyone else whispered about me. But this time, it was different. I held my head high, clutching my notes, and reminded myself of every lonely lunch, every sneer, every time I had been dismissed. I stepped onto the stage, the spotlight blinding, and looked out at the crowd. 1,000 faces stared back, attentive and expectant, and for the first time in my life, I felt seen not from my clothes, my background, or my age, but from my vision, my resilience, and my achievements. I began to speak, my voice growing stronger with every sentence, recounting my journey from being ignored in high school to building $1 million company from my bedroom. I shared my struggles, the betrayals I had faced, and the nights I had spent crying over spreadsheets and business plans. And then something extraordinary happened. People began clapping, nodding, connecting with my story in a way I had never imagined. After the speech, a group of students from my old high school approached me. I recognized them instantly, faces I had once passed in the hallways, the same people who had whispered, laughed, and ignored me. Their expressions were a mix of shock, disbelief, and awkward admiration. "Is that really you?" one of them asked, voice trembling. I smiled politely, feeling a surge of calm triumph. "Yes," I said, "it's me. And every day I was ignored, I was building this." I didn't gloat, but the message was clear. Invisibility had been temporary, but persistence and courage were permanent. Later, in interviews, articles began calling me the girl who was overlooked but conquered everything, and I realized that all those years of pain had transformed into a story of empowerment. I was no longer the girl hiding under the cafeteria table or the quiet student everyone dismissed. I was a leader, a creator, and someone who had turned rejection into unstoppable momentum. And deep inside, a quiet sense of justice settled over minute revenge, but validation. The world had finally seen what I had known all along, that even the quietest, most ignored voices can rise to heights no one expected. And that being underestimated is often the first step toward achieving greatness. Asterisk as my company grew. So did my confidence, and I began to realize just how far I had come from the girl who had once been ignored in school. I remember walking through the new office for the first time, the smell of fresh paint mixing with the hum of computers and chatter of employees. Glass walls reflected my image, and I paused for a moment, staring at myself, thinking about the girl who had carried that worn-out backpack through crowded hallways, whose voice had been drowned out by laughter and whispers. The contrast was staggering, almost surreal. I had built this empire from nothing, yet the memories of being dismissed fueled every decision I made. Every time a new product launched or a milestone was reached, I reminded myself that this wasn't just business, it was proof that perseverance beats ridicule, that silent determination can overcome the loudest doubts. One afternoon, a former classmate reached out on social media, tagging me in a post. "Wow, never thought you'd make it this far," it read, a faint echo of the laughter and sneers I had endured years ago. For a moment, anger bubbled up, the old wounds resurfacing, but I took a deep breath and realized that I no longer needed their validation. I had earned my success through sweat, tears, and relentless focus. Around the same time, my company faced a major challenge. An unexpected competitor launched a similar product, trying to undercut our prices and lure our customers away. I remember sitting in the boardroom with my team, the weight of the potential loss pressing down on me. I could have panicked, but instead, I felt the old fire ignite, that same spark that had carried me through high school and my early business struggles. We brainstormed, innovated, and adapted, creating a new marketing campaign that not only saved us from the setback, but doubled our engagement. That night, as I walked alone through the quiet office, I realized that resilience wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving, about turning every obstacle into an opportunity. And somewhere deep inside, I felt the culmination of years of struggle, betrayal, and invisibility transforming into pride. I had become the person I had imagined on those lonely nights under the bleachers, the girl who had whispered to herself that one day she would be unstoppable. Now she was here, standing tall in a world that had once ignored her, proof that no amount of mockery or dismissal could define a person's worth. The journey had been long and painful, but it had created a version of me stronger than I ever thought possible, and for the first time, I truly believed that nothing, not even the people who had once ignored me, could take away what I had built with my own hands. Asterisk. The moment of full recognition came unexpectedly, and it was more powerful than I could have imagined. I was attending a charity gala, an elegant event filled with influential people, sparkling dresses, and the soft murmur of champagne glasses clinking. I had been invited as a keynote speaker, a position that would have seemed impossible to the girl I used to be, sitting alone in the cafeteria, ignored and dismissed. As I walked into the grand ballroom, the lights reflecting off the crystal chandeliers, I caught sight of familiar face-me former classmates. Some of them were leaning against the bar, whispering, clearly surprised to see me standing tall, radiant in a sleek dress, confidence radiating from every movement. Their expressions shifted from casual curiosity to genuine shock as I approached the podium, ready to speak. I could feel their eyes on me, the very same eyes that had once ignored my existence, now searching for a clue to how I had become someone they couldn't ignore. I began my speech, recounting my journey not in bitterness, not to shame anyone, but to inspire and to show that determination could transform a life. I watched as the crowd listened, nodding, hanging on every word, and my former classmates' faces slowly turned pale with awe. After the event, I mingled with attendees, and one of them, a girl who had once mocked my worn-out shoes, approached me tentatively. I never knew, she stammered. You've done all this. I smiled gently, the calm satisfaction of someone who had overcome every obstacle radiating from me. Yes, I said softly. And every time someone doubted me, every laugh, every whisper, only made me stronger. She looked down, ashamed, and I realized that this wasn't about revenge. It was about proving to myself that my worth had never depended on their approval. That night, I walked home under the city lights, the air cool against my skin, and thought about the journey from the ignored girl, hiding in the cafeteria, to the woman who had built $1 million company with her own hands. I felt a deep sense of closure, a quiet triumph that was more powerful than any applause or recognition. The fire that had been kindled by loneliness and doubt had become a blazing testament to resilience. And for the first time, I understood fully, being ignored doesn't mean you're insignificant, and being underestimated doesn't define your limits. The world may not notice at first, but persistence, courage, and belief in yourself can turn invisibility into undeniable success. And those who once doubted you will eventually see that the quietest voices often carry the loudest impact. Asterisk. In the weeks after the gala, my life felt surreal, like I was living in a world I had only imagined in late-night daydreams while hiding under my blanket, wishing for a life that seemed impossible. Emails poured in from media outlets wanting interviews, investors calling with offers, and people from all over the world reaching out to thank me for sharing my story. I spent a morning scrolling through social media and saw countless messages. You inspire me. I never thought someone like me could achieve so much. I wish I had your courage." Each one made my chest tighten with a mix of pride and disbelief. Even my former classmates started tagging me in posts, sometimes awkwardly trying to reconnect. And I realized that my story had become a symbol, not of revenge, but of transformation. One afternoon, I received a call from a teacher I had loved in high school. Her voice trembled as she said, "I never forgot you. You were always so determined, even when no one else noticed. I'm so proud of everything you've done." I felt tears prick my eyes, not from sadness, but from the realization that recognition and validation can come from the right places, not from those who once mocked or ignored you. My company had grown far beyond what I had imagined. What had started as a tiny online store in my bedroom was now a brand recognized nationally, with offices, a dedicated team, and products reaching thousands of customers. Every milestone, every success, carried the weight of every lonely cafeteria, every whispered insult, and every moment I had been overlooked. I had taken the pain of being ignored and turned it into something beautiful, something that no one could ever take away from me. And yet, even with all the wealth, all the recognition, and all the achievements, I realized the most important victory wasn't financial or social, it was the person I had become. I had learned resilience, patience, and the incredible power of believing in yourself when no one else does. That girl who had once been invisible had grown into a woman who could face the world without fear, who could turn betrayal into strategy, and who could find strength in the memories of her struggles. Walking through the office one evening, watching my team work passionately, I smiled, knowing that I had finally built something that mattered, not just money, not just fame, but a legacy of courage, determination, and triumph over doubt. I had proven to myself that being ignored was never the end, it was just the beginning of a journey that would shape me into someone unstoppable. Asterisk, looking back now, I realized that every moment of being ignored, laughed at, and underestimated was preparing me for something far bigger than I could have imagined. I think about the first day of high school, walking through crowded hallways with my worn-out backpack, the sting of whispers and sneers, and I marvel at how far I've come. That girl who felt invisible, who longed to be noticed, is still inside. Maybe she's stronger, fiercer, and unstoppable. One morning, I received an invitation to speak at a National Youth Leadership Summit, and as I stood on that stage, thousands of students staring up at me, I saw their eyes full of curiosity, doubt, hope, and fear. I began my speech, telling them about the cafeteria lunches, the sneers, the moments when I felt I didn't belong. I watched as the students leaned forward, captivated, and I realized something profound. My story wasn't just about me. It was about every person who had ever felt small, unseen, or worthless. Afterward, a group of teenagers approached me, and one shy girl whispered, "I feel invisible at school too, but you gave me hope." My heart swelled, and I knelt to meet her eye to eye, saying, "You're not invisible. You just haven't found your fire yet. But it's inside you, always." That was the moment I understood that my greatest triumph wasn't the $1 million company, the recognition, or even the people who finally noticed me, was the resilience I had cultivated and the power I could now share with others. Even the classmates who had once ignored me now watched my rise, some reaching out tentatively, some still in disbelief. I didn't need to prove anything to them anymore. My success spoke for itself, louder than any insult ever could. I had transformed every ounce of pain, every betrayal, every moment of invisibility into fuel for my growth. And in that transformation, I discovered the true meaning of strength and vengeance. Not approval, but belief in oneself, and the courage to rise no matter how many times the world tries to knock you down. As I walk through my company offices now, Seeing young employees inspired to chase their dreams, I feel a deep, quiet joy. I survived being invisible, and in doing so, I became someone impossible to ignore. And that, more than any paycheck or headline, is my real victory. The girl who once sat alone, ignored, and dismissed, is now the woman who stands tall, empowered, and unstoppable. A living proof that being underestimated is never the end. It is the beginning of a story worth telling.